The sea has always taken as much as it gives. For every shipwreck pulled from the waves, there are rescuers who never came home. These are the stories of lifeboats that went out to save others, and disappeared, capsized, or broke apart in the same waters they tried to conquer. Each wreck left lessons carved into coastlines, shaping how rescue at sea would change forever. South Shields Providence Lifeboat, 1849, Tyne, UK. Night fell early over the mouth of the River Tyne on December 4th, 1849. The wind was sharp from the northeast, driving waves hard against the English coast. Out beyond the harbour lights, a brig called Betsy had gone aground on the Herd Sand, one of the most feared stretches of shifting shoals near South Shields. From the shore, signals flared through the storm. A ship was trapped, and its crew needed help. Inside the lifeboat house, men gathered without hesitation. The boat was named Providence, a heavy oar-powered craft of the kind used before engines or self-righting designs. 24 volunteers climbed aboard under the command of coxswain Lancelot Byrne. These were fishermen, pilots and dock workers, men used to hard seas bound by a single duty, to go out when others could not come back. The first decision was simple but deadly. The weather was near hurricane strength, and waves were breaking in long lines over the bar. Some suggested waiting for daylight, but the Betsy was breaking apart fast. Every minute lost might cost lives. Byrne gave the order to launch. The boat was hauled down the beach by hand, disappearing into foam and darkness. The tide was ebbing, the wind rising. Spray froze on the men's coats as they pulled against the current. For more than an hour they fought to reach the stranded vessel, timing each pull between the surges that threatened to pitch them sideways. The roar of the sea drowned every word. The second decision came as they approached the wreck. The Betsy lay canted on her side, the crew clinging to the rigging. The Providence had to get close enough for a line, but not so close that the next wave would throw her against the hull. Byrne shouted orders. Oars to starboard, hold steady, wait for the break. They inched forward. A towering wave struck before they could react. It lifted the lifeboat, twisted it, and smashed down across the bow. The men tried to bail, but the next surge flooded the stern. In seconds, the Providence was broadside to the sea. One more breaker rolled her completely over. From the beach, lanterns could be seen flickering through sheets of spray. People heard shouting, then silence. 20 of the 24 men vanished into the black water. Only 4 managed to cling to the overturned hull until they were washed ashore. Among them was Byrne, half-drowned and speechless, his crew gone. At dawn, the wreck of the lifeboat lay broken on the sands. The tide gave back bodies throughout the morning. The villagers lined the shore in grief as each was carried to the church at the lough. 20 coffins, side by side, filled the nave. For the community of South Shields, it was the heaviest loss in living memory. The tragedy of the Providence struck at the heart of Britain's lifeboat service. It revealed a fatal weakness in the lifeboat designs of the time. They could float but not right themselves. Once overturned, they became traps. Engineers and naval architects took note. Within months, the Duke of Northumberland funded a competition for a safer, self-righting lifeboat. From that initiative came a new generation of craft that could recover from a capsize, setting the pattern for all that followed. The sacrifice of the Providence crew also reshaped how lifeboats launched. Stations began to study tide patterns, wind windows and bar conditions before committing to a run. The lesson was not cowardice, it was calculation. Courage alone could no longer be the measure of a rescue. For South Shields, the memory lived on in the stone of the Mariners' Church, where a plaque still bears the names of the men who rode into the storm and never came back. Each December, the town remembered them as the first link in a chain that forged safety from loss. Their mission had been clear: reach the Betsy, save her crew, return home. Instead, the sea kept its own. Yet, from their decisions, every choice made in the roar and confusion of that night, grew the understanding that would save countless others. What began as one of the darkest nights on the Tyne became the moment the lifeboat service learned how to survive its own bravery. Whitby lifeboat disaster, 1861, Yorkshire, UK. At dusk on the 9th of December 1886, the wind had reached full ferocity across the Ribble estuary, a west-northwesterly gale carrying sleet and snow showers into the darkness. Off the coast near Southport, a German bark named Mexico, bound from Liverpool for Guayaquil, lay at anchor but drifting fast, struggling to hold in the storm. The crew cut their masts, fired distress rockets, lashed themselves to the rigging and waited. Meanwhile, On the shore at Southport, the volunteer lifeboatmen of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution Station were summoned. The local lifeboat, the Eliza Fernley, was hauled through surf and darkness to launch into the night. At the same time, from neighbouring St Anne's, the Laura Janet prepared to venture out. Across the water, the tide raced, breakers lofted, and the gale screamed like a beast waking. 11 p.m, Southport's crew launched the Eliza Fernley. Oars hammered against the water, the sail set, and head feeds of sea spray hit the men full in the face. They fought forward into the storm toward a faint light hanging from the stricken bark's mizzen. On board the Mexico, the crew watched shadows in the waves, hoped for deliverance, but the sea refused mercy. 11:20 p.m. At St Anne's, the Laura Janet pulled away into the gale. Its launch was delayed by the mass of sandbanks and the fierce onshore wind. The boathouse doors shut behind the volunteers, the horses snorted in fear, and the carriage rattled along the beach path. 2 lifeboats, 2 crews, 1 target, but no knowing of how far this night would stretch. 11:45 p.m. The Eliza Fernley reached the wreck zone. The Mexico lay on the horse bank, broken by the waves. The lifeboatmen attempted to come alongside to take survivors aboard, but the sea struck. A breaker crashed midships, the boat rolled, the oars flew, water poured in. 2 men clung to the keel and survived, 14 did not. Approximately midnight, the Laura Janet never reached the bark. Somewhere out in the gale it capsized. All 13 of her crew drowned. The lifeboat later floated ashore, overturned in the morning light. Witness points offered no answers. Early morning, the 10th of December. A third lifeboat, the Charles Biggs from Lytham, made its way through the dawn gloom. She rowed mile after mile in the still savage seas, shattered oars behind her, water coming in fast. She reached the Mexico and rescued all 12 of her crew. 36 men had set out in lifeboats, 44 by some counts. 27 lives were lost that night, the worst single loss of lifeboat crew in RNLI history. Across Southport and St Anne's, the toll was counted. 16 families widowed, 50 children without fathers. The 2 towns staggered under the shock. Telegrams were sent, crowds gathered, church bells tolled. The marine architecture of rescue had been tested and found wanting. In the weeks that followed, investigation and reflection began. Why had these lifeboats capsized while a third survived? It was discovered the Charles Biggs had ballast tanks that gave stability. The other 2 did not. They had similar hulls, similar crews, but one design flaw made all the difference under load. A naval architect examined the launching positions. The Southport and St Anne's boathouses were too far from deep water. The carriage launches placed crews into the worst breakers. Lifeboat procedure was going to change. Fundraising also changed. The disaster raised thousands in public subscription. Schools held collections, bands paraded. A new culture of Lifeboat Saturday sprang up, where floats, brass bands and volunteers took to the streets raising money for station upgrades. This had its roots in the 1886 disaster. Design, location, training all came under scrutiny. The RNLI introduced self-righting lifeboats, wider beams, watertight compartments. Launching sites were relocated closer to clear channels, carriage paths regraded, boathouses repositioned. At Southport, a new boathouse was built. At St Anne's, a monument to the lost was erected on the promenade. The names of Johnson, Timms, Bonney, Fisher and their mates are carved in stone for a reason. In that winter storm, 2 boats went out to save 24 men on the Mexico. They brought courage, but the sea gave back death. Their loss became the turning point, a painful, public failure which forced reform. The volunteers of Southport and St Anne's had acted with everything they had, and the sea took everything. They stepped into the gale with oar and sail, believing rescue was possible. They found chaos. Their journey, their struggle, their disappearance would echo across decades in lifeboat design and rescue culture. The night of 9, the 10th of December 1886, changed the face of life-saving on Britain's dangerous coast. Caister lifeboat disaster, 1901, Norfolk, UK. The wind began to rise over the Norfolk coast on the evening of November 13th, 1901. By nightfall, it had become a gale. Waves rolled in from the North Sea and broke over the long, sloping sands that ran offshore from the village of Caister-on-Sea. To the men who lived there, the sound of the surf meant danger. The Barber Sands were alive again, and a ship was in trouble. Just before midnight, the crew of the lightship stationed off the sands fired their distress rockets. From the beach, flashes of red and green lit the clouds, quickly swallowed by wind and spray. Inside the boathouse, the call went out. The Caister lifeboat Beauchamp would go. The men gathered without hesitation. They were fishermen, beachmen, pilots, ordinary men used to heavy work and bad weather. 12 in all, led by coxswain Robert Hooke. On the dunes, families and neighbours helped haul the carriage toward the sea. The sand was soft, the air thick with sleet. Every movement forward was a struggle. Twice the carriage wheels sank. Twice they freed it again. It was past 2 a.m. when the boat finally reached the edge of the surf. The wind was howling directly on shore, tearing at clothes and ropes. The command was given to launch. The lifeboat slid down the grease skids and into the black water, but the sea caught her broadside and hurled her back onto the sand. The men tried again. This time she cleared the breakers, rising and falling in the half-light of the storm. From the beach, lanterns were barely visible through the sheets of spray. Old James Haylett, a veteran lifeboatman too frail to serve, stood watching. His sons, his grandson, and his son-in-law were all aboard. He could only wait and listen to the wind. The Beauchamp fought its way through the outer surf toward the bar. That bar, a long hidden ridge of sand beneath the surface, was the true danger. As each wave ran up the ridge, it broke violently, throwing walls of white water into the air. The lifeboat had to cross it at exactly the right moment, meeting the rise head-on. If she turned even slightly, the sea could roll her. In the chaos of that night, timing failed. A breaking sea struck from the quarter, lifting the stern and swinging the bow. The next wave came broadside, and in one instant the boat capsized. Some men were thrown clear, others were trapped beneath the upturned hull as it drifted back toward the shore. When the first light came, the wreck lay just 50 yards from the beach. Villagers waded in, pulling bodies from the freezing water. 3 men were still alive, clinging to the keel. 9 were dead. Their families gathered in silence around the shattered boat. That morning, the people of Caister carried the fallen into the boathouse. They laid them out on planks side by side. Someone whispered that they had been offered the chance to turn back earlier, but had refused. At the inquest days later, when reporters pressed for an answer, old James Haylett spoke the words that would echo across Britain. They would never turn back. Caister men never turn back. The phrase spread through every coastal town and newspaper. It captured the spirit of the lifeboat service. Brave, stubborn, relentless. Yet behind it was a lesson written in sand and water. The bar had been underestimated. The slope of the beach, the angle of the surf, and the design of the lifeboat all played their part. The Beauchamp was a heavy, non-self-righting craft. Once overturned, she could not recover. Her broad beam made her stable in calm water, but deadly in breaking seas. The launching path from the boathouse to the tideline was too long and too shallow, forcing a dangerous run through the inner breakers. Every variable that night worked against them. In the days that followed, the community buried its dead. The churchyard filled with mourners. Bells rang through the wind. Donations arrived from across the country, sent by strangers who had read of the disaster. The money built new boathouses and better equipment. Engineers studied the slope of Caister Beach and redesigned the launch site to face deeper water. From this tragedy came change. The Royal National Lifeboat Institution began to replace the older Norfolk and Suffolk-type boats with self-righting models that could survive a capsize. Crews received new training for bar crossings and surf launches. Caister itself eventually formed its own independent lifeboat station, carrying forward the same resolve but with safer tools. Years later, a monument rose in the cemetery, 12 names carved in stone. Beside it, a public house took its name from Haylett's words, "The never turn back." The wind still moves over the dunes, the sea still breaks on the sands, and the memory of that night lingers in every story told along the coast. In the dark hours before dawn, the men of Caister rode into the gale and vanished beneath it. The tide brought them home one by one. Their courage remained, not in the roar of the storm, but in the quiet promise that followed, to understand the sea better, so that others might live. Rye Harbour, Mary Stanford, 1928, Sussex, UK. The night before the disaster, November 14th, 1928, the wind had been rising steadily along England's southern coast. By dawn, it was a hurricane. In Rye Harbour, a small village tucked behind the shingle dunes of Sussex, doors rattled and windows trembled under the strain. The sea was a mass of white-capped ridges breaking endlessly over the shallow banks offshore. At 5 in the morning, the first maroon rocket pierced the dark sky. It was the signal no one ever ignored. A ship was in distress. A second and then a third followed. Dogs barked, lamps were lit. The lifeboat crew of Rye Harbour, 17 men in all, gathered at the boathouse. Most of them were related. Fathers, sons, brothers, cousins. They had answered this call many times before. The message was clear enough. A steamer, the Alice of Riga, was reported to have collided with another vessel and lost her rudder somewhere off Dungeness. The storm was pushing her toward the coast. If she grounded, she'd break apart. The only hope was for the Rye Harbour crew to reach her before that happened. The boat waiting on its carriage was the Mary Stanford, a 37-foot Liverpool-class pulling and sailing lifeboat. She had 14 oars, 2 sails, and no engine. Heavy and strong, she relied entirely on muscle and wind. Every rescue began the same way, by dragging the massive carriage across the soft sand to the sea. In the driving rain and screaming wind, the men struggled to move her. Waves broke high up the beach, covering the shingle in foam. They made 3 attempts to launch before the surf swallowed the bow and forced them back. On the 4th try, the rollers aligned, and the Mary Stanford finally slid free into the roaring channel. The time was around 6 a.m. The storm was now at its peak. Visibility was almost zero. The men rowed hard, heads down, soaked through, their voices drowned by wind. Every wave that passed over the boat carried a ton of water. The men bailed continuously with their caps. Salt burned their eyes. Behind them, the faint outline of the village vanished into mist. At almost the same moment, far out at sea, another rescue was already underway. The crew of the Alice of Riga had been taken off by a nearby ship, the Smyrna, which had come to assist. Around 7 o'clock, the Coast Guard fired the recall rockets. 3 bright bursts meant to bring the Mary Stanford back. But from the distance, with rain and spindrift covering everything, no one aboard could see them. The sound of the rockets was smothered by the storm. For the men of Rye Harbour, the rescue was still ahead. They pressed on toward a position that no longer held a casualty. The storm had turned the sea into a boiling plain. Each crest broke like a cliff. They could neither see the Alice of Riga nor know that she was already safe. The lifeboat disappeared and reappeared between walls of water, heading roughly east. The Mary Stanford was not a self-righting lifeboat. Her design relied on stability, a wide beam and heavy keel, but if a wave caught her sideways, she would not recover. That was the price of the pulling and sailing type. The men knew it, yet it was all they had. Sometime after 8 a.m, witnesses along the beach near Camber reported seeing a dark shape rolling in the distance. It looked like a hull turning over, then vanishing. No one could be certain. The storm kept pounding until late morning. At around 10:30, the upturned Mary Stanford was seen drifting shoreward, about 3 miles west-southwest of Dungeness. By 11, the first bodies began washing ashore. Fishermen from the nearby village ran down to help, but there was nothing to be done. 15 men were recovered before noon. 2 others followed later that day. None had survived. Word spread quickly. In less than an hour, the tiny harbour village filled with officials, reporters and families searching for confirmation. The mission hall was converted into a makeshift mortuary. The local women prepared shrouds. Some of the victims were fathers and sons laid out side by side. The oldest was 47, the youngest just 17. The funeral took place on November 20th. 15 coffins were carried through the narrow streets on horse-drawn wagons. The procession stretched for half a mile. Church bells rang through the wind. Thousands came to pay respects. Fishermen from all along the coast, naval officers, lifeboat crews from Dover to Shoreham. The king sent a message of condolence. Newspapers called it the blackest day in the history of the service. In the following inquiry, every detail was examined. The recall rockets had indeed been fired. The boat had left later than expected because of the fierce surf. The decision to launch was correct under the information given. But the investigation pointed to something deeper, the design of the boat itself. The Mary Stanford was too heavy to row effectively in hurricane-force winds and too vulnerable once broadside. She was not self-righting. A single breaker could trap her hull and roll her over, as it did that morning. The difference between rescue and tragedy had come down to design, to communication, to conditions beyond control. The crew had gone out believing they could bring others home. The reality was that the world had changed. Ships were getting larger, storms more unpredictable, and lifeboats needed to evolve. The reaction across Britain was immediate. Donations poured in from all classes of society. Schoolchildren sent pennies, seamen sent wages. Over £35,000 were raised to support the widows and children. The Royal National Lifeboat Institution launched a comprehensive review. Non-self-righting lifeboats were gradually withdrawn from exposed coasts. Launching paths and carriage designs were re-engineered to shorten the distance to the tide line. Wireless equipment began to be considered for stations, allowing recall signals to be transmitted by radio rather than rockets. At Rye Harbour, a granite memorial was built overlooking the dunes. Each man's name was carved deeply into the stone, a list of families tied together by one event. Inside the church at Winchelsea, a stained glass window glows with images of the storm and the lifeboat that never came back. Years later, new generations of lifeboatmen would walk past those names before every launch. The wind still cuts across the marshes, the bar still shifts with the tide, but the lessons of 1928 remain built into every hull that carries the lifeboat crest. 17 men left their homes before dawn, believing they were saving strangers. They faced a storm that no human strength could master. Their courage became the bridge between two eras, the old world of oar and sail and the modern world of engines, radios and self-righting designs. The sea took them, but it also changed because of them. Penlee Lifeboat, Solomon Brown, 1981, Cornwall, UK. The storm that came in from the Atlantic on December 19, 1981, was unlike anything Cornwall had seen in years. All through the afternoon the wind built to a scream, bending trees, shaking windows and flinging spray high over the harbour walls of Mousehole. By evening, the lights along the coast were flickering in the gusts. The sea was rising fast, black and boiling, its sound carrying miles inland. People closed their shutters and waited for the night to pass. At the Coast Guard station in Falmouth, a message came through from a ship in trouble. The Union Star, a small cargo vessel only a few days out of the shipyard, had lost engine power while rounding Land's End. Without power, she was being blown steadily toward the cliffs. On board were 8 people: the captain, his wife and 2 teenage daughters, and 4 crew. Every minute brought them closer to the rocks. At Penlee Point, the volunteer lifeboat crew were called to the station. They were men from Mousehole and the nearby villages, fishermen and mariners who knew this sea better than anyone. Coxswain Trevelyan Richards took charge. Outside, hurricane-force winds howled over the cliffs, but no one questioned the decision. The Solomon Brown, a 47-foot Watson-class lifeboat, built of wood and powered by twin diesel engines, was readied for launch. Families gathered near the slipway, shielding their faces from flying sand. At 8:12 that night, the carriage was released and the boat slid down the concrete ramp into the raging surf. The wave that met her almost swallowed her whole, but she rose again, bow first, and vanished into the darkness. Over the radio came the brief report, "We are proceeding to the casualty." The people left behind watched the sea swallow their light. The wind tore through the village, rattling signs and knocking slates from roofs. Somewhere out in that storm, 8 men were heading toward another 8 who waited for rescue. The Union Star was drifting northeast across Mounts Bay, her captain trying to restart the engines as waves taller than houses broke over the deck. A Royal Navy helicopter from Culdrose flew in from the west, the pilot fighting to hold position above the rolling ship. Twice he tried to lower a winch line, and twice the wind spun the aircraft away. The fuel warning came on. The helicopter turned back to refuel. That left only the lifeboat. The Solomon Brown reached the Union Star around 8:35. In the chaos of the storm, the 2 vessels could barely hold station. On shore, the radio operator at Falmouth heard fragments of speech, the voice of Richards coming through the static, calm but urgent. The lifeboat made one attempt to come alongside and was thrown off. A second attempt failed. On the 3rd try, she managed to touch the coaster's port side. A crash of metal followed by a single message broke through. "We've got 4 off, male and female." 4 of the 8 on the Union Star had made it aboard the lifeboat. That was the last transmission anyone would ever hear. A few minutes later, the radar screen showed both targets merging and then disappearing from view. On the cliffs above Lamorna Cove, people who had been watching the lights saw them vanish as one. Then there was only darkness. All through the night the search continued. The wind screamed through telephone lines. Coast Guards fired flares that were snuffed out as soon as they left the barrel. The helicopter returned after refuelling but could see nothing in the sheets of rain. Waves pounded the rocks like thunder. By dawn the storm had eased slightly. The first light revealed wreckage scattered across the coast. Pieces of timber and twisted metal floated in the surf near Boscawen Cove. The hull of the Union Star lay broken against the cliffs. Among the debris were fragments of the lifeboat, the wheelhouse roof, a section of rail, a lifebuoy marked Solomon Brown mousehole. There were no survivors. 8 lifeboatmen had launched the night before. Trevelyan Richards, Nigel Brockman, Charlie Greenhaw, Kevin Smith, John Madron, Barry Torrey, Gary Wallace and Stephen Madron. All were lost. In Mousehole, the news spread quietly from house to house. Curtains were drawn, doors left ajar. The church bell rang 8 times. No one spoke above a whisper. Over the next days, the small fishing village became the focus of national grief. Reporters filled the narrow streets. The faces of the crew appeared on every front page, their last photograph together taken only weeks earlier in front of the lifeboat house. Donations arrived from around the world. Children sent letters in pencil and crayon. Within days, the fund for the families had grown beyond anything the RNLI had ever seen. The loss of the Solomon Brown cut deep into the heart of the lifeboat service. Questions were asked, but there were no easy answers. The sea that night had been too powerful for any vessel, the winds too violent for any machine to hold. The crew had done everything right and paid the ultimate price for it. In the following years, Penlee became a symbol of courage and duty. The old boathouse on the point was closed and preserved as it had been on that night. The clock above the door stopped at 8:45. A new lifeboat station was built at New Lynn, where launches could be made directly from deep water, safe from the breakers that had trapped the old slipway. The first boat assigned there carried a brass plate engraved with the names of the 8 lost men. Every December 19th, at 8 o'clock, the lights of Mousehole are switched off for 1 hour. The harbour goes dark. Only the sound of the wind and the sea remains. People stand in silence, remembering the moment the Solomon Brown left the slipway and disappeared into the storm. The legacy of that night runs through every lifeboat that launches today. The reforms that followed changed training, communications and equipment across the entire service. Radios became mandatory. Hulls were redesigned to survive the kind of punishment that destroyed the wooden boats of the old generation. The story of the Solomon Brown became required reading for new recruits, not as legend, but as warning. In the village, the grief never entirely lifted. The families who lived on the harbour still kept a light in their windows on winter nights, a small signal to the sea. The lifeboat house stands quiet on the rocks, its slipway overgrown with weed, the railings rusted by salt and time. Tourists sometimes walk down to look at it and fall silent when they read the plaque. The wind is almost always blowing there, carrying the same sound the men heard when they launched. It begins as a whisper, turns into a roar, and then fades into the steady breathing of the tide. The sea that gave them their lives and finally took them back. Longhope Lifeboat, TGB, 1969, Orkney, UK. A southeasterly gale had been battering the Orkney Islands for days. On the 17th of March 1969, the seas around Hoy and South Walls were already wild. Wind driving snow sideways, waves breaking in spume that rose like clouds above the pier at Brims. At the lifeboat shed at Longhope, the crew of the TGB prepared themselves for what might be the worst challenge they ever faced. The call came through. The Irene, a Liberian-registered cargo ship, was adrift with no power off South Ronaldsay. The waves were towering, the wind fierce. For the men, the decision was clear. Launch. At 20 o'clock, they released the TGB down the slipway into the storm-torn waters of the Pentland Firth. Decision 1. To go. The sea was hostile. Visibility was near zero in driving sleet and rain. But the crew of 8 men who lived for this duty knew many mariners were depending on them. They launched. Decision 2. Route and timing. The TGB set off through the flood tide and wind opposing each other, a deadly combination in that channel. At 21:07, the radio operator at Wick received a message. The lifeboat was 1 mile east of Swona. They were tracking, fighting their way. Decision 3. Approach. At 21:15, the Irene grounded near Grimness. The location relayed to the lifeboat was acknowledged at 21:28. At that time, the TGB was still making the passage. The conditions were described later as maelstrom conditions. The sea did not allow mistakes. Decision 4, persistence and risk. The crew pressed on despite the odds. They were a closely knit group, friends, neighbours, relatives. Coxswain Daniel Kirkpatrick and his 2 sons were part of the crew. They had launched, as they had many times before, into the storm's teeth. But the weight of the waves that night outmatched experience. Then came a moment that no decision could fully guard against. The TGB was last seen with her stern light near the Pentland Skerries at about 21:35, fighting the sea. After that, the radio went dead. Calls went unanswered and the search turned inward, not for the Irene, but for the TGB. At 13:40 the next day, the task force found the upturned hull of the TGB, 4 miles southwest of Torness Hoy. 7 crew were dead aboard. The 8th was missing. The boat had capsized, struck by what was estimated to be a wave over 100 feet high. The mission to save others had ended in the disappearance of the rescuers themselves, witness and wake. In the tiny community of Brims, half the workforce had set out that night aboard the lifeboat. Grief struck deep. The funeral in Wall's Old Parish Church on the 22nd of March was attended by RNLI officials, hundreds of islanders, and even the Queen Mother's message of condolence. Donations poured in. A memorial service at St Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall would draw over 1,200 people. Echoes and reform. The disaster at Longhope exposed a fatal weakness. The TGB, a 47-foot Watson-class motor lifeboat built in 1962, was not designed to self-right if capsized. After the inquiry, the RNLI accelerated the move to self-righting hulls. Equipment, training, station siting, all were reviewed. The pension scheme for families was improved. The appeal for the dependents raised over £92,000, an enormous sum in those days. The station at Longhope did not close, but the memory of those 8 men changed the design and operation of every lifeboat to follow. The sea that night had thrown the worst of itself at a crew who never hesitated. The ship they set out to aid was spared, but the lifeboat men were not. Their choices, launching into a known storm, the route across one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the British Isles, the refusal to turn back. Those decisions built the chain, and when the chain broke, the shock sent ripples through the lifeboat service. In Brims, in the museum that now sits where the shed once stood, photographs of the crew still hang. On every anniversary, the names Dan Kirkpatrick, Jimmy Johnston, Bob Johnston, Robbie Johnston, Jack Kirkpatrick, Ray Kirkpatrick, Eric McFadyen and James Swanson are read out aloud. The waves still roll across Hoy and South Walls, the wind still cuts through the Pentland Firth. The lesson remains, in rescue the line between saving and being lost is thin, and when that line fails, change must follow. Broughty Ferry, Mona, 1959, Dundee, UK. Late on the night of December 8, 1959, the southeast gale had reached full power off the east coast of Scotland. A bitter storm whipped through the Firth of Tay, waves charging in from the North Sea, spray driven like shrapnel against the shore. At Broughty Ferry, the lifeboat station stood ready but aware. This was a night for caution. Just after 2:40 a.m, word came in from the Coast Guard at Fyfeness. The lightship anchored off the North Car Rocks had broken her moorings and was drifting. The reef lay almost 2 miles off Fyfeness, and shipping lanes crossed nearby. The danger was clear. The station crew of the Mona launched at 3:13 a.m, 8 of them climbing aboard a 45-foot Watson-class motor lifeboat. The youngest, barely 22, the oldest in his 50s. They knew the risk. The bar they faced was the entrance to the River Tay, the line where the safe river waters gave way to the open sea. Sandbanks and shifting buoys marked it in calmer weather. Not tonight. 2 buoys that normally marked the passage were missing, dragged away by the currents in previous weeks. The flood tide was running westward against the gale. To cross that bar meant torment. They fought their way down the estuary, past Budden Ness into broader water. At 4:06 a.m, a shore lookout at Abertay light vessel spotted the Mona, ploughing through waves that dwarfed the hull. She reached the bar area near Budden Ness, where shallow water combines with breaking seas to form a deadly threshold. The wind drove the waves, the tide held them. The lifeboat's bow hit a roller, the stern lifted. In that moment, any mistiming could roll her. Radio contact continued till 4:48 a.m. When the Mona reported she had seen the distress rockets fired by the North Car, that was the last message. After that, nothing but silence in the storm. The shore stations kept calling, but no answer came. At daylight, a search was launched. The hull of the Mona was found capsized on Budden Sands, the mast grounded, the boat bottom up. 7 bodies were recovered that morning, an 8th never found. On the beach, the bar anatomy became painfully visible. The shifting sands, the broken buoys, the shallow bank where waves steepened and broke with lethal force, these all combined that night into one great trap. The Mona had crossed the bar into deeper water, but the sea flung her back. She rolled. The proof lay in the damage. Hull full of water, engines at half speed, no fault found. The lifeboat launched in perfect condition. It was the environment that won. In Broughty Ferry, the grief washed in with the tide. The 8 men lost were coxswain Ronald Grant, 28, second coxswain George Smith, 53, motor mechanic John Grieve, 56, bowman George Watson, 38, James Ferrier, 43, John T. Grieve, 22, Alexander Gall, 56, and David Anderson, 42. The community lined the streets for the funeral. The church was full. Candles flickered in windows. The memorial plaque on the boathouse wall carries their names now, and each year relatives place wreaths at the foot of the slipway. Their loss changed things. The investigation confirmed the boat was seaworthy, the crew all experienced. The missing buoys and difficult bar crossing were marked down. Few risked launching from the Tay again without more scrutiny. The RNLI began a program of reviewing station siting, lifeboat design and launch procedures in shallow estuaries. Broughty Ferry later received a relief boat in just 2 weeks. 38 young volunteers signed up within days. On the shore at Budden-ness, the sea still shapes the sandbanks. Waves still break into shallow water with a roar. Locals walk there and speak quietly of that night. The Mona's slipway at Fort Street stands quiet, the station rebuilt. The anniversary is marked each year by a short ceremony and the lighting of 8 lanterns. The sea that took them also pressed for change. Alone on the beach at dawn that day, a man found a life jacket marked Mona floating in the surf. He wrapped it in a cloth and handed it to the station. It sits in the Boathouse Museum now, a silent reminder of the boundary between river safety and open sea danger. The bar's geography and the storm's power combined in a single night of sacrifice. The men went out into the dark believing they could bring the lightship's crew home. The North Car's crew survived. The Mona's did not. The physical threshold where the Tay meets the sea claimed them. Their memory now informs every lifeboat station where bar crossings and estuary mouths define the line of no return. Fraserburgh, John and Charles Kennedy, 1953, Scotland, UK. The morning of the 9th of February 1953 dawned cold and overcast on the northeast Scottish coast. A heavy swell had built off the Moray Firth and winds from the northeast gusted in St Fergus and Fraserburgh harbours. At just after 8 a.m, the crew of the lifeboat stationed at Fraserburgh received the alarm. Several fishing boats were struggling to return through the swell and swell-driven tide into the harbour. The lifeboat, the John and Charles Kennedy, readied for service. The boat itself was a 46-foot Watson-type cabin motor lifeboat, built in 1937 with twin 40 GP diesels. She had served her station with distinction, over 90 launches and nearly 200 lives saved. The crew that day were coxswain Andrew Ritchie, mechanic George Duthie, bowman Charles Tate Sneener, assistant mechanic James Noble, and 3 other crew, John Crawford, John Buchan, and 1 more. All experienced fishermen and lifeboatmen accustomed to the sea's moods. Their first job was to escort 2 of the fishing vessels safely back into Fraserburgh harbour. They succeeded in guiding both safely and despite the rough sea. On completion, they set off again on the return leg, the sea still wild, the swell still high. The boat turned to head back across the harbour entrance, the tide still running out, waves and swell combining. It was at this moment their rescue mission shifted into danger. The craft had completed the escort, confidence was building, and the plan was simple: return to station. But the reality of the harbour mouth at Fraserburgh that day was harsher than the plan. The West Pier and breakwater created a lee on one side and a funnel effect on the other. Waves crested higher where sea and tide collided. The lifeboat would cross this zone. As the John and Charles Kennedy approached the breakwater's eastern end, the swell was directly astern quarter. A large wave lifted the stern and threw the bow upward. In that instant, the boat lost stability. The water poured over the cabin roof and into the engine room. The tilt overcame the cabin's design. The vessel capsized, throwing the crew into the icy water. Messages from shore watchers stopped. Only silence remained. Search and rescue efforts began immediately. Nearby boats and crew scrambled to help. The harbour tug, Coast Guard launches, the pierhead crew all aided. But the sea gave nothing back. In time, the bodies of 6 men were recovered. Andrew Ritchie, George Duthie, Charles Tate Sanya, James Noble, John Crawford and John Buchan. 1 crewman survived, Bowman Charles Tate Jenner, and 1 ailed missing. For the town of Fraserburgh, the loss cut deep. The rescue versus reality dynamic was stark. They had gone out believing they would return. They had acted with purpose, competence and duty. But the swell and tide at the harbour entrance turned their hope into tragedy. The lifeboat that had rescued others now became the casualty. The water held its own rule. In the aftermath came reflection. Investigations noted that the boat structure, although modern for its time, was not self-righting. The Watson-type cabin boats relied on stability rather than recoverability. In heavy seas and large swell, capsize risk remained. The harbour entrance layout, the combination of swell and tidal flow, was also identified as a hazard. Launch and recovery across the zone of conflict between sea and harbour presented real danger. Public response was immediate. The RNLI and local community raised funds for the dependents of the men who died. A relief lifeboat was staged quickly at Fraserburgh. The station soon replaced the John and Charles Kennedy with another craft, the Duchess of Kent, which itself would face tragedy years later. The disaster at Fraserburgh prompted a review of lifeboat hull design across stations in Scotland and northern England. The move towards self-righting hulls was accelerated. Older non-self-righting types were flagged for review. Training procedures for harbour entrance crossings and tidal swell conditions were updated. In the town itself, memorials appeared. A plaque in the lifeboat house lists the names lost. Each year the anniversary is marked by the crew, local townsfolk and relatives standing quietly beside the harbour wall, listening to sea and wind. The names of Ritchie, Duthie, Tate, Noble, Crawford and Buchan echo across generations. The crew of the John and Charles Kennedy had done what was asked of them. They answered the call, operated with skill, and trusted their craft and sea. The reality they faced proved harsher than any drill. Their sacrifice mailed the lesson to lifeboat stations. Even when rescue seems familiar, the sea can overturn certainty. Fraserburgh, Duke of Rothesay, 1919, Scotland, UK. The lifeboat sat quietly in the boathouse at Fraserburgh, its name painted boldly across the bow, Lady Rothes. Commissioned in 1915, she was a motor lifeboat with a 40 GP petrol engine and 2 sets of oars ready for storms too strong for the engine alone. Funded by the father of the Countess of Rothes, her arrival marked a new era for Fraserburgh's lifeboat station, a modern craft built to meet modern dangers. On the morning of the 28th of April 1919, the sea was changing fast. A north-northeast gale was building off the east coast of Scotland. The Admiralty drifter Eminent lay disabled off the south end of Fraserburgh Bay, signalling for help. The Lady Rothes and her volunteer crew launched into the levels of wind and swell that they had trained for. But the sea that day would test her as she'd never been tested before. This is the story of the boat as much as the men. The hull was wide-bodied, with protective plating and decking built for the long runs across the North Sea. She'd already earned the crew's confidence in lesser storms. Inside sat a cabin for shelter, a motor to power her, and inboard gear familiar to the men who served aboard. She represented hope, rescue, and the promise that men in trouble would not fight the sea alone. Into her bow the waves hammered. The crew made contact with the Eminent. The vessel's engine was dead, drifting dangerously toward shoals. The Lady Rothes set her bow toward the casualty, braving the wind, the troughs, the spray. At first the mission seemed straightforward. Approach, take off the drifter's crew, return home. But as the lifeboat crossed the bay, a heavy breaker smashed into her port bow. The force knocked her on her beam end. A second wave struck almost immediately. The motor stalled. The Lady Rothes capsized. The object biography element lies here. The boat had been designed to survive capsizes. She was self-righting in principle. But the sea had found a moment when the design could not or did not hold. The boat rolled, righted herself, yet the moment of vulnerability cost lives. Of the 13 men on board, 2 died. Coxswain Andrew Noble and acting second coxswain Andrew Farquhar. The rest of the crew survived, badly shaken, some injured. The boat itself survived and returned to service, but the faith in technology had been shaken. The lifeboat sat again in the boathouse. The name Lady Rothes unchanged, but the meaning behind it shifted. What had seemed sufficient, a motor, a self-righting hull, coats and gear, was revealed as only part of the equation. The sea was unpredictable. The bar of the bay, the combined swell and wind, the moment when the motor failed, all of it combined into a catastrophe. In the years that followed, the echoes of that event reached far beyond Fraserburgh. At the station, the local crew kept the boat maintained, but the RNLI as an organisation began to re-examine what self-righting actually meant in extreme conditions. The Lady Rothes had shown that even a self-righting design could fail if overwhelmed by nature. Design changes followed. Stronger hulls, better capsizing recovery, improved life jackets and gear. The crew's experience with the boat that day forced the reform. At Fraserburgh, a memorial stands. The names of Noble and Farquhar are carved in granite. Every year, the current coxswain and crew lay a wreath at sea in memory of those who died in service. The boat's name remains part of local law. The tall tale of the Lady Rothes is told to new volunteers, not only for her service but for the lesson she taught, that the boat alone cannot guarantee survival. Training, design, environment, all must align. The object biography of the Lady Rothes thus becomes more than wood, metal and engine. It becomes a turning point. Because of her, because of what she endured and what the men suffered, the RNLI accelerated the transition to more robust hulls, to larger motors, to rescue craft that could more reliably face the North Sea's extremes. Her survival after capsizing allowed the next generation to learn from her, not in theory, but in hard reality. The sea that day did not respect the name on the bow or the faith of the crew or the technology of the time, but the legacy of that capsizing boat did reach into future decades. The Lady Rothes remains a story and symbol of rescue, of failure and of reform. St Ives lifeboat and SS Alba, 1939, Cornwall, UK. The storm swept in from the Atlantic on the night of January 31st, 1938. In the bay at St Ives, the wind had risen to gale strength hours before, but the sea changed as dusk fell. Waves climbing, spray stinging the harbour windows, shadows shifting behind curtains. On board the steamship SS Alba, loaded with coal and bound for the Mediterranean, the engines faltered and the anchor dragged. The captain realised too late that the lights he saw through the storm were not those of his destination. The vessel came ashore on the rocks at Porthmeor, broadside to the surf. Within minutes the maroons rang out from the lifeboat station of St Ives. The call went to the crew of the motor lifeboat Caroline Parsons, the first motorised craft at the station. The men hurried into oilskins, launched the boat and pushed her into the black water of the bay. Time at sea. Outbound. The lifeboat rounded St Ives Head, the sea breaking in walls of white water. Waves of more than 40 feet, crew later said, lifted the boat and dropped it into troughs that no ordinary craft should meet. Radio chatter, if it reached shore, was lost in the roar of the wind. On the deck of the Caroline Parsons, the crew fought to reach the Alba, their lights briefly visible through the spray. After the casualty was reached, the transfer began. The Alba's crew of 23 climbed down a pilot ladder into the lifeboat. The lifeboat men placed the survivors low on deck to keep the centre of gravity low and prepared to return to shore. All aboard were believed safe. Then, as they pulled away, a gigantic wave struck the lifeboat broadside. The Caroline Parsons capsized, cross-cut. What was happening ashore while at sea? In the town, fishermen and families waited near the quay, listening for signals, watching the lights. When 3 maroons were fired, they left the harbour wall to watch from the headland. Smoke and spray whipped across their faces. Some turned away, but many stayed. When the lifeboat's mast light vanished behind the cliffs, a hush fell. Back on the water, the lifeboat righted herself. The design did what it was built to do. But the moment of chaos cost lives. 5 men of the Alba's crew never made it back. Some drowned that night, others vanished in the waves. The lifeboat itself lay battered, driven ashore, wrecked on the rocks. The tide brought her into the sand at dawn, broken and silent. Witness and wake. On the beach at dawn there were lifebelts, boots, bits of wreckage strewn across the shingle. Survivors shivered under blankets. Locals pulled the injured to shore. A woman waited for her husband. A child waited for his father. They found each other. In the harbour, a line of cars formed, headlights shining across the beach. The town had lost some of its own. Memorials followed. At the boathouse, a plaque reads the names of the men who went out into the storm. In the museum in St Ives, there is the battered wheel of the Caroline Parsons. A lantern from the lifeboat stands under glass, its brass tarnished by sea salt. Each January, the station lays a wreath at sea. The sea belongs to rescue, but sometimes rescue belongs to memory. In the wake of the disaster, lifeboat procedures at St Ives and across the RNLI changed. Self-righting hulls were re-examined, engine stalling in capsized condition was addressed, survival training improved. Launching in heavy seas from shallow harbours became a focus. That night of rescue and loss rewrote what the crews knew about their own limits. The sea took a ship, took 5 crew, shoved a lifeboat onto the rocks. In the storm-tossed bay of St Ives, the rescue that began in hope ended in grief. The names of those lost hover in the spray each winter night, carried by the wind, and each time a lifeboat leaves the harbour, their story goes with her. Mumbles lifeboat and SS Sam Tampa, 1947, Wales, UK. A cold spring evening off the Glamorgan coast, April 23, 1947, brought what survivors would later call one of Britain's roughest storms. The wind drove from the southwest, the tide surged up the Bristol Channel, and off Scare Point the sea rose in walls of water. On board the Liberty ship SS Sam Tampa, bound from Middlesbrough for Newport, engine failure left her helpless in the gale. She drifted toward the rocks at Scare Point. The position was desperate. At the Mumbles lifeboat station, the volunteer crew of the motor lifeboat Edward, Prince of Wales, heard the alarm just after 6 in the evening. The night was black, the wind already biting, but the call was clear. A ship in distress. With 8 men aboard, the coxswain and his crew, they launched in pouring rain, spray lashing across the pier at Mumbles. They believed they would go out, reach the Sam Tampa, bring survivors home. That was the rescue they expected. The lifeboat battled across Swansea Bay through broken seas, racing against tide and gale. Somewhere between shore and the wreck, reality twisted the plan. The Sam Tampa had grounded on Scare Point before the lifeboat arrived. Her tanks were ruptured and oil slicked the sea around the rocks. Waves bigger than the lifeboat rose, broke and rolled over each other. Smoke and spray mixed with black oil. The lifeboat tried to approach her, every wave battered her. The boat's radio signals were lost in static. Shouts could not be heard above the roar. In one of the final transmissions, the lifeboat signalled she was turning back, but the line was broken. Somewhere out in the storm, the boat capsized. Dawn revealed her hull upside down, driven ashore near Scare Point. All 8 lifeboatmen were gone. On the wreck Sam Tampa, 39 men had also died. 47 lives lost in one night of rescue. The mission that set out to save was swallowed by the sea. Back in Mumbles and Porthcawl and the Coast Guard posts, the townsfolk stayed waiting. The cars parked on the beach turned their headlights to the sea. Rockets were fired from the rocks but broke short, snuffed by wind and spray. The oil slick made the sea look glassy, calm though men had fallen. A shore observer later described seeing the lifeboat rise, disappear, then nothing. The wake of that night reached far beyond the coast. In the morning the wreckage sat silent. Lifebelts, boots, bits of wreckage on the sand. Survivors of the Sam Tampa's crew had no help coming. Families from Teesside, from Glamorgan, from Mumbles walked to the beach in grief. At the funeral in Oystermouth, the church overflowed. The names of the 8 lifeboatmen and 39 sailors were read quietly. Donations arrived nationwide. The event struck hard at the heart of rescue services across the British coast. The reality of that storm night overturned expectations. The crew of the lifeboat had believed that they could manage the sea, but the sea's violence that night defeated the best cavalry of brave men and strongboat alike. The oil slick around the wreck had trapped the lifeboat in what seemed calm water, but in fact a death trap of hidden danger. The bar of the channel, the tide, the slick, the gale, all combined. The rescue plan collided with nature's fury. In the wake of the disaster, the lifeboat service changed. At Mumbles, a memorial window was placed in All Saints' Church. A plaque at Scare Point marks the place where the lifeboat and ship were lost. Reviewers of lifeboat techniques studied the night. The need for radio, the need for better stability, the need for safe launch and recovery zones, even in extreme conditions. The oil slick danger, the tide power of the Bristol Channel, the risk of broken anchoring in storm, they all became lessons. Each year on the 23rd of April, the village of Mumbles holds a commemoration. Lanterns light the pier, names are read aloud. The sea still rolls in from the channel. On the low sand flats at dusk you can see the ripple where the lifeboat last cut through the waves. The memory remains, not as a grand tale, but as a warning, that rescue is never a guarantee, and that the line between saving and being lost is thinner than any hull's beam. Monomoy US Life-Saving Service, 1902, Cape Cod, USA. A northeast gale had been building along Cape Cod for days when, on the evening of March 17, 1902, the coal barge Wadena struck Shovelful Shoal off Monomoy Island. A small craft in shallow but dangerous water, the barge grounded in the storm and signalled for help. The surfmen of Monomoy Life-Saving Station prepared to launch into the night. The bar they faced was both literal and deadly. The shifting shoals around Monomoy, the shallow waters of Cape Cod's edge, the sudden drop-off into deeper sea beyond. The geography meant that a craft crossing from shore to the wreck site would need to pass through breakers, over shoals, then into open sound waves. The surfboat launched just before midnight, manned by 7 surfmen. Their goal, reach the Wadena, transfer her 5 crew and head back to shore before the storm fully claimed them. The first minutes of the run were deceptively calm. The surfmen rowed hard, pulling into the darkness, the barge's lights flickering. But as soon as they crested the shoal ridge, the sea changed. Walls of water rose ahead of them, and the boat was caught in the trough between outer breakers and shoal surf. One wave struck the starboard side, lifting and then slamming her down. The boat capsized. In that overturn, the 7 surfmen of Monomoy perished. The Wadena's 5 crew also died in the wreck or its aftermath. In total, 12 lives lost in one night of rescue. Back on shore, the residents of Chatham and Monomoy watched the gale rage. Marine lanterns flickered through spray. The life-saving station's log recorded waves reaching heights of 30 to 40 feet out beyond the shoals. The telephone wire from the station to the mainland cracked under the wind. At dawn, wreckage washed in. An oar, a surfboat mast, parts of the hull. A memorial obelisk at Station Chatham would later mark the names of the lost surfmen. The anatomy of that bar crossing was dissected in the weeks to follow. The shoal ridge at Shovelful shifted with the storm tide. The flood tide combined with the gale made the surf unpredictable. The rescue route forced surfmen into a zone where shallow water turned deep abruptly. Waves formed with little warning and capsizing risks soared. The equipment of the time, a surfboat launched from the beach, pulled through surf, rode into deep breakers, proved inadequate for that environment. The tragedy at Monomoy triggered reform. The US Life-Saving Service reviewed station locations, launching methods and boat design. Self-righting surf boats were studied and developed. Stations reviewed launch apparatus to ensure boats could reach wrecks without crossing volatile bars. Communications improved. The memory of those 7 surfmen underscored the principle that the bar, the shallow to deep interface, is one of the most dangerous zones a rescue craft can face. On each anniversary, many gather at the obelisk near Station Chatham. The wind still carries salt and spray across Monomoy Point. The shoreline there remains marked by shifting shoals and waves that hide their danger until it's too late. The surfmen who lost their lives that night gave the service knowledge that would save others. USCG Triumph-Mermaid tragedy, 1961, Oregon, USA. A cold winter afternoon at the mouth of the Columbia River, January 12, 1961. Southwesterly gales bore down, and the tip of Oregon faced what mariners call the graveyard of the Pacific. In the early hours, the 34-foot crab boat Mermaid lost her rudder while fighting for position off Peacock Spit. The call came in, "Mayday, we're drifting into the breakers." The clock started ticking. Decision 1, launching anyway. At the nearby United States Coast Guard station at Cape Disappointment, the alert went out. The fishing boat was helpless, the sea rising fast, the bar ahead treacherous. A 40-foot utility boat, CG40564, and a slower 36-foot motor lifeboat, CG36454, were launched into worsening conditions. The crew knew the bar was dangerous. They also knew they had to act. Decision 2, calling for more strength. As the utility boat laboured towing the Mermaid, the surf rose, visibility dropped, breakers grew. The coxswain realised his vessel was underpowered for what lay ahead. He radioed Point Adams for help. Bigger boat was coming. The Triumph, a 52-foot MLB CG52301 from Point Adams, would take up the tow. The decision was made. Decision 3, taking the tow. Around 7 p.m, Triumph rendezvoused and assumed custody of the Mermaid. The tow line pulled taut. The seas were already at their worst. The bar ahead at Peacock Spit lay ahead, shallow water merging with heavy ocean swells and a fierce current. Every wave threatened the tow and the saviour alike. Decision 4, crossing the bar. The bar is no straight line. It is a living, shifting ridge of shallow water where ocean rollers break. At the Columbia mouth, the flood tide clashed with the gale-driven sea. Massive swell, breaking waves 20-30 feet high, spray blinding, foam flying. The Triumph now pulled the Mermaid toward the river's mouth. The crew watched the seas rise around them. Behind them, the other boats struggled. Ahead lay the bar. Decision 5, persisting despite warnings. The tow line parted once, then again. Triumph reconnected, but the seas worsened. At 8:13 p.m, the report from the Mermaid, Triumph capsized. One man, Engineman Joseph Petron, had been pulled aboard the Mermaid. 5 of the 6 aboard Triumph were lost. The rescue mission had become a recovery operation. Only one survived the capsize. Gordon Huggins clung to wreckage. Floated ashore hours later. The bar's anatomy became chillingly clear that night. The shallow spit under deep water made waves break unexpectedly. Shoals, tides and wind combined into a machine of chaos. What looked like deep water was dangerous. Each wave held power to flip vessels built for rescue. The Triumph, wooden-hulled, not self-righting, was hit by 3 massive rollers in succession. She rolled on her beam, capsized and sank. Newer craft would take decades to catch up. On shore, foot patrols searched the sand under gale-force wind. Debris came in, life jackets still buckled, the propeller from the Triumph, bits of hull numbered CG 52301. Family and friends waited at Lightship Columbia and station houses, hundreds of miles distant. Memorial services followed. The loss would rank as among the worst in US Coast Guard rescue history. From the chain of decisions, from launch to call for help to tow to bar crossing to persistence, every step was premised on faith in the craft, the men, the station. But the bar's anatomy turned them inward. The shallow to deep transition, the surge of wave after wave, the trap of the spit, they found no margin for error. In the months after, Coast Guard doctrine shifted. Investigations singled out the Triumph's design. Wooden hull, insufficient righting capability, inadequate for that bar. The sea had exploited every weakness. The service accelerated its move to self-righting steel MLBs. Stations reviewed bar crossings, launch angles, tow capacities, weather thresholds. Cape Disappointment added more robust protocols. The motto, "You must go out, but you don't have to come back," gained grim meaning. The sea at the mouth of the Columbia still holds memory. On each January 12th, a wreath drifts across the spit. Survivors gather, and young crews read the names lost that night. The Triumph-Mermaid tragedy remains as much a lesson in rescue as a story of loss. Quillayute River, MLB. 44,363, 1997, Washington, USA. It was near midnight on the outer coast of Washington state, February 12, 1997. The storm had already been blowing for 12 hours, and the Pacific was raging. Winds over 50 knots ripped through the spruce trees above the small fishing port of La Push. The roar of the ocean filled every street. At the Coast Guard station at the mouth of the Quillayute River, watchstanders followed weather reports and bar readings. The tide gauge rose with every minute. At 12:34 a.m, the radio cracked with a call from a sailboat. The Gale Runner, a 32-foot sloop, had lost her mast about 10 miles offshore and was drifting toward the coast. The sea around her was white with breaking surf. She had no sail power, only a weak auxiliary engine, and her position was near the entrance to the river mouth. The coxswain on duty, boatswain's mate 2nd Class David Bosley, made the decision. He and 3 others would launch. Their boat was MLB 4363, a 44-foot motor lifeboat built for surf work, steel-hulled and heavy, designed decades earlier but still in service. At 12:36, the men ran down the ramp into the night. Bosley at the helm, machinery technician 3rd Class, Matthew Schlimme as engineer, Seaman Clinton Miniken as crewman, and Seaman apprentice Benjamin Wingo on deck. They wore exposure suits and helmets. The floodlights around the pier shone briefly on their boat before it vanished into spray. At 12:45, the first message came over the radio. "Cross the bar, seas 16 to 18 feet. On shore, the duty watch glanced at one another. Reports from the buoy outside showed waves closer to 28 feet, some breaking over 30. At that same moment, the bar lights flashed red. It was still technically open, but everyone knew the reputation of that crossing. The Quillayute Bar was a shallow shelf where deep ocean swells met the outflowing river current. When the tide and wind opposed each other, the result was chaos. Steep breaking waves that came from no single direction. At 12:50, station Quillayute River tried to raise the boat. Static answered. Then a short burst of voice. "Heavy surf proceeding west." The clock kept ticking. The gale runner's last known position was about 4 miles off La Push. The wind veered southwest, gusting near 60. Ashore, the power flickered in the village. The ocean was now black and boiling. At 12:57, the first wave struck. The boat rolled hard to starboard, nearly 90 degrees. Wingo, braced inside the cabin, saw water pour through the side windows. The hull shook, then righted. Seconds later, another wave came from the port quarter. The lifeboat pitch-poled, flipping end over end. Wingo was thrown into the cabin bulkhead. The radio went dead. The boat righted again, but one man was missing from his station. The engineer called out. The response was the sea. On shore, the watchlog missed check-ins. At 1 a.m, a garbled transmission. Capsized, disoriented. It was Bosley's voice, then silence. The men on duty at the tower activated the distress plan. The next ready boat, MLB 44361, was prepared to launch, but the breaking waves over the bar made departure impossible. The crew could only watch the blackness outside and hope the four were still alive. At 1:20, witnesses from the village reported a white light near James Island, a rocky mass just offshore from the river mouth. That light disappeared, then reappeared, then went dark for good. The lifeboat had been carried there by the tide. By 2 a.m, helicopters from Air Station Astoria were airborne, their searchlights sweeping the sea. Wingo was found clinging to the overturned hull, battered and half-conscious. He was pulled aboard and flown to shore. The others were missing. At dawn, the storm still howled. The wreck of MLB 44363 lay broken on the rocks of James Island, engine still idling in spurts. The bodies of Bosley, Schlimmer, and Miniken were recovered in the hours that followed. The gale runner that had sparked the mission grounded north of La Push. Her crew survived. The rescuers did not. The crosscut of that night plays like 2 clocks running at once. The minutes of decision at the station and the seconds on the water where events turned fatal. Each choice, reasonable at the time, became another link in a chain that could not hold. Launching when the bar was marginal, crossing when the seas were already rising, pushing forward when visibility dropped. None of it reckless, all of it done in duty. The anatomy of the Quillayute Bar was the unseen antagonist. The river channel funneled water out at speed, while the gale forced the ocean inward. The result was a collision of forces directly under the lifeboat's path. Breakers formed where depth changed from 40 feet to 12 in seconds. Waves rebounded from the cliffs of James Island and met the incoming sets. In that confusion, the lifeboat was hit not by one wave but by several converging at once. The 44-foot MLB was strong but heavy, slow to recover. Designed in the 1960s, she could self-right only under limited conditions. In surf twice her own height, she rolled again and again until structure and crew were broken apart. By morning, the Coast Guard's command centre at Seattle had declared all 4 casualties. Flags across the service were lowered to half-mast. The investigation that followed ran for months. It noted that the crew acted properly and professionally, that the decision to launch matched the standards of the time. But it also found that the equipment had reached its limit. The 44-foot lifeboat fleet, once the backbone of coastal rescue, was now decades old. The disaster at Quillayute accelerated a change already underway. Within a year, the new 47-foot MLB program was pushed forward. The new design would be faster, with a fully enclosed bridge, shock-absorbing seats, twin diesels, electronic navigation, and the ability to self-right in under 10 seconds after a complete roll. Its hull shape drew lessons from that night. Deeper keel, more buoyant superstructure, and improved centre of gravity control. The very shape of modern Coast Guard rescue work was born from the failure of the older model. At the station on the hill above La Push, a memorial plaque bears the names of the 3 lost men, Bosley, Schlimmer, Minniken. Each year on the anniversary, the current crew gathers there. A wreath is taken out by a boat laid on the water beyond the bar. The wind often blows cold, the surf still breaks in white sheets across the entrance, and the sea sounds the same as it did that night. The echoes of that mission continue in every Coast Guardsman trained in heavy weather rescue. When a 47-footer launches into the bar today, its crew hears the same rumble, feels the same pull of the tide. The technology has changed, but the danger has not. What happened at Quillayute in 1997 remains carved into the DNA of the service. A night when 4 went out, 3 never came back, and an entire generation of life-saving boats was born from what the sea took away. DG's RS Alfred Krupp, 1995, Borkum, Germany. It was the night of January 1st, 1995. A new year had begun, but the North Sea did not care. Along the German coast, gales were screaming through the darkness. Offshore, the sea rolled in heavy uneven walls of grey water that caught the reflection of the Borkum lighthouse and broke it into fragments of light. Inside the small harbour, the 27.5-metre rescue cruiser Alfred Krupp waited in her berth. She was one of the DGSRS's proudest vessels, a modern, fast and powerful rescue cruiser built in Bremen and stationed at Borkum since 1988. Her name came from the Krupp Foundation, a major supporter of Germany's maritime rescue service. She carried a crew of 4 that night, men who knew the sea, men who had launched into storms before. At around 9:30 p.m, the call came through the radio network. A small ship was drifting and in danger somewhere off the East Frisian coast, near the Ems estuary. Its engines had failed, and it was being pushed towards shoals. No one knew if the crew would last until morning. The Alfred Krupp's coxswain, 41-year-old Günther Wieting, gave the order. They would go. The first decision, to launch. On land, the wind measured over force 10 on the Beaufort scale. Snow flurries stung faces, visibility dropped to almost nothing, but the duty to answer distress outweighed the warning flags that whipped above the pier. The men pulled on survival suits, checked lines and cast off. The engines thundered. The ship's hull, painted red and white, cut into the harbour swell and vanished into the blackness. The second decision, to continue. Outside Borkum roads, the sea was wild. Cross-seas slammed into the hull from different directions, throwing spray over the deck. The cruiser climbed each wave and crashed into the next. Inside the wheelhouse, the crew tried to track radar contacts through static. The lights of Borkum faded astern. The temperature dropped toward freezing. At 9:50 p.m, the Alfred Krupp reached the search area. Another smaller rescue boat, Bremen, had already been dispatched but was further east. The target vessel had reportedly regained some control, and coordination began between radio stations. The situation appeared to ease. By 10:10 p.m, the Borkum crew had confirmed that the casualty was no longer in immediate danger. The third decision, turn for home. With the mission complete, the cruiser came about, heading back through the outer shoals toward the island. It was the most dangerous part of the journey. Returning against the wind, waves behind them, steering through shallow ground and tidal turbulence. The radar showed white static from spray. The men inside the wheelhouse could see only darkness and foam. The fourth decision, stay on course. Every man aboard knew that a following sea could lift and roll even a rescue cruiser. But the tide window was narrow, and the captain decided to continue. The waves were now reaching nearly 12 metres, breaking irregularly, sometimes from the side. At 10:14 p.m, roughly 2 nautical miles west of the Westerem's buoy, it happened. Out of the blackness came a roar. A single wave, larger than any before it, broke directly against the starboard side. The Alfred Krupp rolled violently to port, righted, then rolled again, further this time. The mast snapped, antennas sheared away, equipment flew across the cabin. A second wave followed immediately, striking the stern quarter. The ship turned beam onto the sea and capsized completely. Inside, chaos. Lights went out. The wheelhouse filled with water. The self-righting system worked, slowly. After a full rotation, the vessel came upright, but the damage was catastrophic. Water gushed through broken hatches. 2 men were missing. The surviving 2, soaked and disoriented, managed to restart the engines. One was injured, the other at the helm. Radio antennas were gone, but they managed to send a mayday on short range. Another DGZRS unit and a Navy helicopter responded. When rescuers reached the vessel after midnight, she was still afloat but heavily damaged. The bodies of coxswain Whiting and mechanic Frericks were recovered later from the sea. On Borkum, families waited at the pier through the early hours. The wind blew snow in sideways sheets. News spread quickly through the village. People walked to the harbour despite the weather. At dawn, the Alfred Krupp limped back into port, her hull dented, railings twisted, superstructure torn. She was still afloat, but she looked as though she had fought a war. In the days that followed, the DGZRS opened a full investigation. The chain of decisions was studied in detail. The choice to launch, the route chosen, the return timing, the behaviour of the vessel under beam seas. Every point revealed how small the margin of safety could be when waves exceed design. The report called it an unforeseeable combination of factors. Mariners at Borkum simply called it the wave. The North Sea has its own anatomy, a network of sandbanks and tidal bars that shift under storm pressure. Near the Ems Channel, shallow ridges rise suddenly from deeper water. When the wind pushes from the northwest, these ridges force waves upward until they break in steep vertical walls. The Alfred Krupp had met one of these rogue walls. It was not the first rescue boat to face it, but it was one of the strongest ever to be rolled by it. Across Germany, the loss struck hard. Newspapers printed photographs of the battered vessel back in harbour. Thousands sent messages of sympathy. The DGZRS command in Bremen vowed to learn from it. In shipyards along the Weser, engineers reviewed the hull plans of the Alfred Krupp class. They studied how water had entered, how the self-righting process functioned, how the bridge had been exposed. From that night came reform. A new design series, G, the 27.5-metre Krupp class, received major changes. The open upper bridge was replaced with a fully enclosed glass structure, watertight doors were reinforced, and electronics were relocated below the main deck. Crew survival suits were upgraded, emergency beacons and satellite radios became mandatory. Training now included repeated roll simulations. The DGZRS also changed procedure. Crews began keeping log entries of return conditions equal in importance to departure weather. Rescue cruisers were ordered to reduce speed in following seas and, if necessary, to heave to and wait for daylight rather than risk a nighttime bar crossing. The loss of 2 men rewrote how hundreds would later be saved. At the Borkum station, a granite memorial was erected beside the boathouse. It bears the names of Günther Wieting and Harold Frericks. Every January 1st, the current crew gathers there in silence. They polish the brass letters on the ship's bell recovered from the damaged vessel. The sea nearby rarely rests. Even in calm weather, small breakers line the horizon, marking where the sandbanks shift with each tide. Inside the station, photographs of the Alfred Krupp before and after the accident hang side by side. In one, she gleams under sunlight, red and white, the German flag rippling above her bridge. In the other, she sits in harbour after the capsize, her mast broken, paint scraped away, ropes tangled across the deck. Between those two images lies everything that rescue at sea means: pride, danger, and the constant exchange between courage and consequence. For the DGZRS, the tragedy became a turning point. Crews that joined in later years were taught the story in detail, not as legend, but as guidance. They learned the chain of decisions, when to go, when to wait, when to turn home. They studied the wave mechanics of the Ems estuary and the new safety drills that followed. Each lesson carried the same message that the Alfred Krupp had written in the storm. Even the most advanced ship can be undone by the wrong combination of sea and choice. Today, when modern German rescue cruisers head out from Borkum or Helgoland, their enclosed bridges and reinforced hulls trace their lineage back to that single night in 1995. Every bolt, every seal, every safety rule has part of the Krupp in it. The sound of her engine still echoes in the memories of the men who saw her leave the harbour for the last time under full power. Her deck lights vanishing into the snow, the sea still remembers too, rolling endlessly over the sandbanks where 2 rescuers gave their lives, where a vessel named for strength met the limits of endurance, and where a nation learned again that rescue has a price measured not in money but in men. Padstow Lifeboat, Georgiana Service, 1867, Cornwall, UK. A December morning in West Cornwall, the year 1867. The wind had been rising all through the night, beating against the high cliffs above the Camel estuary. On the shore at Padstow, the lanterns flickered, perched above the Doom Bar sandbank where the river meets the sea. A merchant schooner, the Georgiana of Boston, Lancashire, had drifted in, her anchors dragging. She grounded on the Doom Bar in the gale. Word was passed quickly, a vessel in distress, a rescue was needed. The crew of the Padstow lifeboat, men from this harbour town accustomed to heavy seas, mustered at the boathouse at Hawker's Cove. They strapped on oilskins, they hauled the carriage toward the beach slipway, and they launched into the surf. The lifeboat slipped into the dark water before dawn. Oars struck out, the sound of wood on waves, the smell of salt and spray. It was the kind of mission they had accepted before, only this one would not end as expected. As they rowed toward the Georgiana, the sea built. Outside the estuary, the full force of the gale and swell met the sandbank. The Doom Bar is no simple rise of sand, it is a shifting ridge of rock, sand and water where waves break unpredictably, where the river ebb and the sea flood collide, and where the water undercuts craft crossing it. The lifeboat approached the wreck, the Georgiana listing on the sand, sails half torn, rigging clinking in the wind. The rescuers closed in, intent on saving the 5 men of the schooner. Eyewitnesses in town watched the dark shape of the lifeboat through the gusts. One recalled how the men seemed small against the white cresting walls of water beyond the estuary mouth. From the cliffs, the noise was thunderous, the surf pounding, foam flying high, and the lifeboat's crew calling out as they fought the oars, fought the tide and the breaking waves. The sandbank made the waves higher and steeper, the sea more treacherous at the edge of the estuary than most outside the cove understood. At the moment of rescue, the schooner's crew were brought aboard or reached shore safely. Not all detail remains, but as the lifeboat withdrew from the wreck, the wind and tide turned against her. A breaker rose behind the sandbank, not part of the regular surf but a rebound wave formed by the interplay of flood tide and deep sea swell. It came with force. The lifeboat was hit, capsized, thrown into chaos. Within seconds, 5 of her crew were lost to the sea. Their names, Daniel Shea, William Intros, Thomas Varco, Andrew Truscott and Michael Crennel. They were volunteers from Padstow, known in the town, fathers, brothers, husbands. When dawn broke, the harbour was quiet except for the grief. The townspeople gathered along the quay at Padstow, eyes wide, faces pinched by sorrow. Lanterns shone on the water, boats were launched for recovery, bodies were retrieved. The lifeboat, righted by the surf and pulled ashore, lay battered, a silent witness to what had happened. In the church of St. Petroc and on a memorial plaque the names were carved. The 5 men's losses echoed across the community. The wake of the tragedy spread further. The news reached the offices of what was then the Institution for the Preservation of Life, from Shipwreck, later the RNLI. Funds were raised in Padstow and beyond. Portsmouth, London, Glasgow sent donations. The institution voted £210 to the Padstow Relief Fund and paid the funeral expenses. The local subscription fund reached more than £2,000. As survivors and families gathered, a new awareness began to settle. The cost of rescue is real. In Padstow on the estuary, the anatomy of the bar became part of everyday talk. Residents knew the Doom Bar sandbank was dangerous. Ships had struck it many times before. Lifeboats had crossed it again and again. But that morning, the bar's hidden hazard had turned the mission into a disaster. The estuary mouth funneled the swell, the bank refracted waves, sudden cross-sea struck the returning boat. The experience of Padstow lifeboatmen changed. The study of the bar's behaviour, the slipping sand, the depth variations, the effect of tide and wind, all came into sharper focus because of what happened. Families of the lost crew stood on the shore years later and told the younger lifeboatmen what that day felt like. The funeral procession wound its way along narrow streets. The boat sickness of grief settled on the town. Candles were lit, hats removed. The lifeboat station set aside moments of silence. The names of Shea, Intros, Varco, Truscott, Crennel were spoken each year, never forgotten. The physical boathouse at Hawker's Cove stood as much as a memorial as a launching point. The trails on the beach, the slipway worn into the sandbanks outside, everything spoke of that moment. The lifeboat that had capsized returned to service, but the memory of her crew lost would shape how the station operated. Launching times became more cautious. Bar crossings were timed with greater attention. The shift in culture at Padstow began that day. On the estuary, tidal charts were adjusted. Observers marked sands and channels with new care. The men in the station kept logs of sandbank shifts, of wave patterns, of tide and swell alignment. The words "never cross the bar at flood tide under gale conditions" became part of the unwritten creed. The tragedy of 1867 therefore became not just a story of loss, but a reference point for change. Young recruits heard the story as part of their training. They walked the slipway at Hawker's Cove, looked at the plaque in St. Patrock's Church, and learned that rescue means going out, but you must also plan to get back. The horizon of the sea taught that lesson in 1867 the hard way. The gleaming memorial in the church showed 5 names under the crest of Padstow, reminding each crew member of the depth of the sea's power. On every anniversary, entries in the station log mention the date. A half-mast flag, a bell tolled. Visitors from other stations came to pay respects. The parish lantern lit the shore. Children who stared at the lifeboat slipway learned of the capstan, the horses that hauled the boat across sand, the oars that fought the waves. The heritage became part of the identity of Padstow. The town knew then that rescue involves more than courage. It involves understanding the sea's transitions, where river ends, where sea begins, where sand lies hidden under waves. The incident pressed home that the bar is the test. The Doombar sandbank remains there yet today. The tide still washes over it, the sea still breaks. But the lifeboatmen who returned in later years did so with more knowledge because of those who did not. At the quay, the lifeboat house, the museum, the epithelial walls of history remember the 5 lost men. Their sacrifice is embedded in the stone. Their names are uttered when the wind rises, when the bar becomes rough, when the boat prepares to launch. The 5 lost are part of every rescue going out from Padstow. They serve as warning, as memory, as haunting. For rescue services around the coast, that day in 1867 at Doombar stands as early proof that bravery alone cannot always win, that the sea carries rules that must be respected. In the long line of lifeboat stations, Padstow's nightmare of February 6, 1867 is one of the earliest recorded where the rescuers became the rescued. Ships have grounded, storms have raged, but the sight of a boat turning over in minutes haunted the harbour for years. The survivors returned, the station continued, but the culture changed. Sandbanks were measured, slipways shifted, and training improved. The memory stayed alive in print, in ceremony, in wave-swept stone. The wind off the Camel estuary still whispers across the sand. The boats still cross the bar, but they cross with more caution. The memory of the 5 drowned men, the capsized lifeboat, the schooner Georgiana and the Doombar, these are more than history. They are the silent teachers at the edge of the water. Point of Ayre lifeboat disaster, 1857 D Estuary, UK. When dawn broke on the 4th of January 1857, the northeast coast of Wales was battered by a fierce winter storm. The wind howled from the northwest, driving the sea across the shallow waters of the Dee estuary. Sandbanks, shifting and treacherous, lay hidden beneath the spray. At the edge of Gronant Marsh, 2 miles west of the headland called Point of Ayre, the lifeboat house of the Liverpool Dock Trustees station readied itself. The volunteer crew were fishermen, miners, labourers and small tradesmen of the parish of Lannister, ordinary men stepping into something extraordinary. By 8:30 the alarm had sounded. A schooner named Temperance of Belfast lay stranded off Abergele, caught on the sandbank. The tide was against her, the sea rising, and the call came to the Point of Ayre lifeboat. The men hauled the boat to the beach, launched into wild surf and rowed for the casualty through a gale that seemed endless. Their belief? They would find the Temperance, take off her crew, and bring them to safety. They trusted their boat, their place, and their duty. They reached the first wreck, a ship on the West Hoyle bank, and found the crew had already been rescued by the lifeboat from Hoylake. Undeterred, they turned toward a second case at the Chester bar, but found the stranded vessel had refloated. Then, under fixed sail because heavy seas made rowing nearly impossible, they set course westward toward the Temperance. The wind whipped their sail, waves battered their hull, spray filled the air. Onshore watchers saw nothing but a dark shape fighting the storm. The rescue plan was simple enough. Under sail, approach the Temperance, take off her crew, return to the station. But the reality was different. The bar at the mouth of the Dee, the shallow bed of sand and ridge called the West Hoyle, turned ordinary waves into monsters. The shallow water forced each swell to rise steeply and break. The outgoing tide, the onshore wind, the shifting sandbars all joined to create unpredictable seas. The lifeboat, under fixed sail and no oars working, moved slower, less able to respond to the breakers. As they passed Rhyl, witnesses reported a great wave struck the lifeboat. The boat heeled, water poured across the deck, the mast cracked. She capsized. 3 of the crew were clinging to the overturned hull. 20 minutes passed. The storm raged. One by one, the men slipped beneath the waves into the icy December sea. None made it back. 12 hours later, the wrecked hull washed ashore. 8 crew had been recovered soon after. 5 more were never found. All 13 men aboard the lifeboat on that mission were lost. Their names: Robert Beck, Master; John Sherlock, Mate; Joseph Davies, Edward Phillips, Edward Roberts; Thomas Owen, John Bledin, Thomas Roberts; David Davies, Robert Roberts; Robert Williams, John Ellis, and Richard Davies. They were fathers and brothers and sons of the parish. Those left behind in Llanasa Parish Churchyard walked the shoreline for days. Lanterns swung in the wind. Families waited at the lifeboat house, hoped for a return that never came. The town gathered in the church, mourned in silence, and buried the men in long lines of coffins. The sea had taken them, those who had gone out to save others. In that moment, the rescue versus reality became stark. The rescue intention: to go out, to save shipwrecked sailors. The reality: a lifeboat under sail in a massive gale, unable to keep pace through shallow nearshore bars, caught by a wave she could not recover from. The bar, invisible below the surface, shaped the fate of every decision. The station had been established in 1826 by the Liverpool Dock Trustees after earlier losses on the bank outside Liverpool. The lifeboat was a large sail and oar craft, non-self-righting, designed for conditions less extreme than these. On this morning, the design limitations showed: the fixed sail choice, the absence of effective oar launch across the bar under storm, the lack of self-righting capability, all combined into disaster. As the tide receded, the boathouse and slipway stood quiet. The field of sand and marsh swallowed the horse carriage tracks. For weeks, families placed flowers by the surf rocks. Church bells tolled. The appeal fund collected hundreds of pounds, and across the region donations flowed. The tragedy set off meetings to examine lifeboat design, to study wear and duty, to ask how rescue stations should manage extreme conditions. At the station, men gave testimony that the men had made known their plans, insisted on launch because others were dying, that they had rowed hard, then pulled the sail, that they had reached deep water and were making way. But when the wave struck, there was no turning back. Investigators pointed to 3 key failings: the lifeboat's non-self-righting hull, the use of fixed sail rather than oars under such seas, and the failure to realise the actual height and steepness of the waves over the sandbank. As a result of the loss, regulations changed. At lifeboat stations, by the Liverpool trustees first, then later through the RNLI, crew operation rules were adjusted. It became an offence not to wear lifebelts, after the inquiry confirmed several crew were without them that morning because they hindered movement. The issue of self-righting design came to the fore. Lifeboats launched from the sea face more than they bargained for. The point of air disaster was one of the first in Britain to show it. In the community of Llanasa, the grief found shape. A memorial stone at St Asaph and St Cinder's Church records the names of all 13. Each year parishioners gather. They walk to the shore, they watch the sea. The boathouse site, long since reclaimed by sand and marsh, remains a place of memory. The sandbanks shift with tide and wind, but the memory of that January morning remains fixed. For the men of the Dee estuary and beyond, the loss was a warning. The sea will punish not only those in distress, but those attempting rescue if the conditions are misjudged. The intention to save is noble, the tools must match the danger, the missions must consider a return as well as reaching out. In the years that followed, lifeboats built for the Dee and similar estuaries grew wider, more buoyant, with lower centres of gravity. They incorporated self-righting features, better cabin protection, and carried fewer sails as primary propulsion. Training emphasised the bar crossing, the shallow to deep transition, the surge of the tide meeting the waves, the point where river gives way to sea, where sandbanks lie hidden, where breaker heights jump. These conditions became part of the lifeboatman's curriculum. The volunteers of Point of Air that morning believed they could go out and return. They launched, they fought, and they were lost. Their story carries across time because even today, Rescue services on coastlines share the same challenge. To save, yes, but also to survive. The sea remembered them, the shore honoured them, and rescue versus reality remains the tension every sailor knows. Gorleston Private Lifeboat Rescuer, 1866, Norfolk, UK. The wind howled across the sands of Gorleston that evening, January 13, 1866. A raw northeasterly gale had swept down the coast of Norfolk, whipping the sea into white foam and tearing at the beach huts and piers of the town. The night sky was a low wall of spray and mist, and the sea seemed to shake the very earth. From the lifeboat station the call came, a vessel in distress. The men knew every hour mattered. The private lifeboat rescuer belonging to the local boatmen's company was prepared in haste. Horse-drawn carriage, crew of 16 men, a mixture of fishermen and beachmen who had launched in storms before. They strapped oilskins, checked oars and sail, cast off from the boathouse at the harbour's edge. Launching into deepening darkness, they believed they could go out, reach the ship in trouble, bring men home. That belief carried them into the gale. As the rescuer crossed the breaking water of the outer harbour, she turned into open sea. Waves crashed high, the vessel crested and fell, each roll throwing spray across the deck. The sail was set. Oars were ready. The crew faced the sea's raw power, their silhouettes seen by watchers on the pier only as shifting shadow in the foam. One by one the oars struck. The boat surged forward into the gale. Witnesses on shore said the waves outside the estuary were taller than the masts of coastal schooners. The tide was flood rising, pushing into the sandbanks at Gorleston and Great Yarmouth. That hydrology meant the bar at the harbour's mouth became a trap. Shallow water forced waves up steeply, and the combination of onshore gale and rising tide made for chaotic breakers. The rescuer entered that zone. The plan: reach the vessel, transfer the crew, return home. The reality: nature had other designs. Once at sea, the crew spotted the ship in distress. A schooner dragging anchor, listing heavy. The lifeboatman approached, commanded by coxswain Robert Spillings, and attempted to bring the men aboard. The transfer was made, the wrecked vessel's crew taken aboard the lifeboat. All seemed accomplished. Then the wind and waves shifted. The returned course toward harbour brought the lifeboat into the teeth of oncoming waves and a rising tide pushing in from the east. The boat's weight now increased, its stability under question. Suddenly a breaker rose ahead of the boat, twisted on the ridge of sand beneath the sea's surface. It lifted the rescuer, rolled her to port, the sail straining, the oars useless. The men shouted, the spray stung, the hull lurched. In that second the boat capsized. The men were thrown into the freezing sea, screams were swallowed by wind. On shore, watchers saw a dark hull flip, then nothing but white water. 12 of the 16 men were lost instantly, a 13th died later of exposure. Only 3 survived the night. At dawn the scene was pitiless. Lifebelts and oars floated in the surf. The boathouse stood silent and empty. Families gathered on the beach. The news spread. The private lifeboat, the very symbol of the town's courage and skill, had failed. The tide carried debris onto the sand, the names of the men lost. Dawkins, Fleming, Harris, Manthorpe, Newson, Parker, Spillings, Welton, Wiley, Woods, Edwards, each a local boatman. Their families waited at home, unaware of the full extent until daylight. In the hours and days that followed, Gorleston mourned. The funerals were held together, the church bells tolled, the harbour community, fishermen, beachmen, merchants, came to the quay in long lines, heads bared to the wind, coffin after coffin carried down the slipway. The sense of collective loss was vast. The fact that the lifeboat had set out in noble occasion did not ease the grief. The sea had turned the rescue into disaster. In the lifeboat house, the equipment lay untouched. The horse tracks in the sand led to the slip, but the boat would not launch for days. The company of boatmen struggled with the question, how had our own craft been undone? The rescuer had been launched into the storm willingly, but the storm had grown beyond what they expected. The bar at the harbour mouth, the rising tide, the shifting sandbanks, all acted together. The anatomy of the place became the lesson. In the weeks after, the local committee and supporters reviewed what happened. The structure of the lifeboat, the method of launch, the crew's readiness came under examination. The wind vane on bank, the tide route notebook, the sand ridge surveys all started to change. Lifeboats were no longer assumed safe simply by manpower and determination. The accident at Gorleston forced a shift in thinking. Rescue craft must match the ocean's power, not just men's courage. Across the coast the news travelled. The story of the rescuers capsizing carried into lifeboat publications. The lessons of Gorleston became part of the national conversation, the institution for the preservation of life. From Shipwreck, later the RNLI cited the loss as evidence that station boats needed better design, safer launch sites, the awareness of bar and tide danger. At Gorleston, the private boat company was eventually superseded by an RNLI station, and new boats built with self-righting features, stronger hulls, better ballast. The memory of 12 lost men shaped those changes. On the shore today, a simple stone in the cemetery holds their names. Every year, local volunteers walk the sands where the boat once launched, recall the wind and the sea that night. Children learning to row and beach haul the boat hear the story of the rescuer and know it is more than history, it is legacy. The loss of the crew is spoken of alongside the rescues they accomplished in life. The day remains in the logs, the yardstick for training new volunteers. As the surf still breaks outside Gorleston in heavy weather, men on the boathouse monitor tides and sandbank shifts more closely than ever. The lessons from 1866 are built into drills. Launch only when tide and sea permit, monitor breaking wave patterns, consider return as part of the mission. The men who went out that night faced the same raw elements that crews still face. They trusted each other and their craft. The sea did not respond to either. In the wake of the tragedy, the community changed too. Relief funds were raised for widows and children. Schools held collections. The boat company pledged safer operations. The very culture of lifeboat work in Gorleston shifted from heroic impulse to studied risk management. The tragedy became the moment when bravery and caution became interlinked. The name of the rescuer remains etched into training manuals, station logs, and local memory. When the next storm arrived on the Norfolk coast, if the wind howled and the tide rose, the men at the boathouse of Gorleston were ready not only to launch, but ready to pause, to judge, to save themselves as part of the mission. The sea expects you to both go out and get back. And from the storm of January 1866 went forth the message. Duty remains, but design, tide sense and bar knowledge matter just as much. Their lives were given in service. The craft they manned capsized in a storm so fierce that even their hairs froze. But out of that loss came change. Safer boats, better training, new respect for the sea's hidden angles. On a grey January afternoon, when the wind slants across the sand and the horizon fades into rain, the ghost of the rescuer still rides the waves. The 12 lost men remain part of every launch from Gorleston to this day. Stonehaven, St. George, 1874, Nebraska, Scotland, UK. Darkness lay heavy over the Aberdeenshire coast in the late evening of February 27, 1874. Near Stonehaven, the wind had risen to a gale, the sea boiling under a bleak sky. At the lifeboat station, the men of the St. George prepared their boat. The seas were rough, the bar at Aberdeen Harbour hidden under foam, but there was a ship in distress, and so the call was clear. They must go out. Decision 1, launch for the Grace Darling. The barque Grace Darling of Blythe had been seen drifting north of Stonehaven, flying signals of distress, her lights flickering in the storm. The St. George's crew mustered quickly. Coxswain James Leaper, assistant coxswain John Brown, and others who had launched many times before, strapped into oilskins, secured oars and sail and set off into the roiling night. Their expectation: reach the vessel, take off her crew and return with lives saved. Decision 2, load for the passage north. The sea was already in motion. The lifeboat, a 33-foot self-righting P&S boat, 10 oars and sail, left the slipway at Stonehaven and headed into the darkness. Rowing and sailing across a sea made furious by wind and tide, the crew fought each stroke. Every wave was a challenge. They were some distance from the casualty, and the storm was pushing the barque further north and outward. Still they pressed on. Decision 3, contact made. Around midnight, the lifeboat reached the Grace Darling. The barque's crew had lowered the distress flags. It appeared the ship had managed to get under control or drifted beyond immediate peril. The lifeboat crew boarded the barque, took on survivors, and prepared to return to safety. At this moment, the mission seemed near completion. The rescue that had begun in danger now seemed to be shifting towards success. Decision 4, return via Aberdeen Harbour. But the storm had other plans. With the bark's distress flags down, the lifeboat chose to make for Aberdeen Harbour rather than return immediately to Stonehaven. The decision to sail northwards toward Aberdeen's entrance exposed them to a severe hazard, the Aberdeen Bar, where shallow water, ebbing tide and breaking seas combined violently. The St. George pulled away from the bark and set course north for the harbour mouth. Decision 5. Crossing the bar, the fatal moment. As the lifeboat approached the harbour entrance, the sea rose in unpredictable rollers. The bar was shallow, steep, and the waves broke hard. A large breaker struck the boat as she tried to cross. The hull rolled. The crew were thrown into the sea. 4 men, Leaper, Brown, Alexander Main and James Lees, were drowned. The boat capsized or was smashed on the pierhead. The mission that began in hope ended in loss. In the minutes before disaster, the scene moved in parallel. On board the lifeboat, brutal seas, heads down, oars and sail fighting each crest. Ashore in Stonehaven and Aberdeen, watchers waiting by harbour walls, ships' lights dancing in spray, bells tolling in churches. But where watchers expected rescue, instead only wreck and grief came. The clock of decisions clicked with each wave, each choice carrying the boat further into risk. Those 4 lost men were brothers in duty, men who answered the call, fought the sea, trusted their boat. The lifeboatmen left sons and wives behind. In the days after the disaster, the coffins were brought home to Stonehaven and Cowie. The churchyard filled, the bells rang for each name. The town carried grief and the lifeboat company carried the question, how had we gone out and not returned? The rescue intention was clear. Take off the bark's crew. The reality was different. Crossing a dangerous bar in heavy seas turned the saving mission into a catastrophe. The anatomy of Aberdeen Harbour's bar-shallow ridge, breaking waves, strong tide, proved itself lethal. The decision to aim for Aberdeen rather than stay offshore or return to Stonehaven proved fatal. The lifeboat's design, the sea's force, the decision to cross at that moment, these combined into the tragedy. In Stonehaven, memorials were raised. At Cowie Churchyard, a stone bears the names of Leaper, Brown, Main and Lees. The Institution for the Preservation of Life from Shipwreck, which later became the RNLI, raised a fund for dependents. Newspapers of the day carried accounts of the storm, of men seen in the water, of watchers unable to intervene. The legacy of that night rippled across lifeboat stations. The return leg must be as carefully planned as the outward run. For lifeboat crews thereafter, the story of the St. George became teaching. That decision to aim for Aberdeen instead of immediate home drew scrutiny. Stations began to study their bars, their tides, wave patterns. They recorded crossing times. They rehearsed return into harbour as a separate mission. They noted that rescue begins with the return. On each February 27th, the people of Stonehaven and Cowie mark the anniversary. A wreath is thrown into the harbour at dusk, the surf still breaking out of sight. The names of the lost are spoken aloud. The men may have gone nearly 150 years ago, but their story remains. The clock of decisions still ticks when a lifeboat slides down the slipway, crosses the bar, races home, and every lifeboatman knows the last leg may be the most dangerous. Tynemouth, Constance. 1864, Tyne, UK. The wooden slipway ran down to the harbour mouth at Tynemouth, but on the evening of the 24th of November 1864 the wind had risen to gale strength and the waves hammered the piers. 2 vessels, the schooner Friendship and the steamship Stanley, were reported in distress off the bar at the Tyne. On the boathouse at the haven stood the Constance, the lifeboat of the Tyne Lifeboat Institution. She was a new craft, lighter and of more modern design than some of her neighbours. That boat, 12 oars, sail and hope, became a story of craft and cost. Let's trace her life. The Constance was built a few years earlier, designed to respond quickly to wreck calls in the North Sea's rough waters. She'd served the station in multiple launches. On that night she was manned by volunteers who knew her hull, her balance, her limits. They believed in her. They launched around dusk, clambering aboard, the wind driving spray across their faces, the harbour lights flickering behind them as the slipway carriage rattled into the waves. Her first move, away from the boathouse, into dark water beyond the breakwater. The sea roared. Her oars struck in unison, the sail was lowered soon after to support the thrust. The crew aimed for the casualties. The elapsed minutes, 3, 6, 10. On shore at the tower, watchers saw the boom of waves smashing into the bar and watched the lifeboat head out. They expected rescue. They did not yet suspect the boat might be the casualty. The Constance reached near Spanish Battery and began her sweep. Her structure creaked under strain, spray accumulate on her decks. Then something went wrong. The seas around the Tyne bar were treacherous. Shallow sandbank, large swell, cross-sea building. The boat encountered what the crew later described as an immense wave. The oars caught mid-stroke, the hull rolled. 2 of the crew, James Grant and Edmund Robson, were washed from the boat and drowned. Some accounts say 4 were washed out and 2 died. The craft hovered between rescue and wreck. Here the object biography element, the Constance, this lifeboat, had been built for speed and agility. She was lighter and more modern. But in that moment she faced the full power of nature. The design that served many times before did not guarantee safety when waves rose past her limits. The hull righted, the crew fought, but the men in the water were gone. The boat returned to station, hull shaken, the burden of loss aboard. At dawn, the wake of that night lay across the Tyne, the harbour slipbank littered with oars, broken thwarts, life rings. The families of Grant and Robson waited. The station committee met. Appeals were opened. The story of the rescue attempt became part of the station's history, not just as a triumph, but as a warning. The Constance remained, but her lessons had changed everything. In the town of Tynemouth, the loss was felt deeply. The volunteers were local, men community knew. The funerals of the drowned men were simple, in faith, in sorrow. The boathouse bay remained quiet for days. The ropes hung slack, the carriage rested untouched. On the harbour wall, people looked out to where the Constance had gone and not come. The wave that capsized her men still rolled beyond the bar. Procedural change followed. Lifeboat stations around the Tyne and beyond began to reconsider boat design, crew safety, the risk of certain seas. The Constance's design as lighter and more modern led to questions. Was speed worth the trade-off in robustness? The boat's biography had marked a shift. Bigger, sturdier hulls, better training for bar crossings, higher caution in launch decisions. The memories of that night were woven into training manuals. The craft stands now as more than wood and oar. The name Constance appears on station honours. In the museum at Tynemouth, you can see her model and read the story of how she served and how she failed. The place where she launched still bears the changes. Slipway reinforcement, wave break extension, recorded tide tables displayed every day. The boat may no longer launch, but her effect still ripples in the service. In the years after 1864, the Tyne Lifeboat Institution grew. The design of lifeboats changed. Launch protocols tightened. The loss of Grant and Robson carried on that night into the sea became a hinge, before and after. The rescue attempt to the Friendship and Stanley ended in tragedy, not because of lack of bravery, but because the realities of nature outpaced the craft's capacity. The Constance's hull proved that the edge is thin between saving and being lost. Every time a lifeboat slides down the slip in Tynemouth, the men aboard carry with them the weight of that history. They carry the name Constance in spirit, the boat that launched for others and yet taught a lesson through cost. The white-capped waves still roll across the bar, and the town still remembers 2 names and many more. Scarborough Amelia, 1861, Yorkshire, UK. The wind came from the northeast and carried the bite of winter with it. It was the afternoon of November 2nd, 1861, and Scarborough Bay looked like a cauldron of grey water and torn foam. Along the promenade, people held onto railings as gusts tore at their coats. The sea was already flooding over the pier wall when the cry went up. A schooner had struck near the South Bay. In the boathouse at the West Pier, a brand new lifeboat waited. She had only recently arrived from London, a gift from the National Lifeboat Institution, and this was to be her first launch. Her name was Amelia. Painted bright white and blue, her hull was built of oak, her copper fittings still shining. The townspeople had gathered to admire her only days earlier. No one imagined her first service would come in such weather, or that it would end in ruin. At about 4 in the afternoon, the lifeboat bell rang. A vessel, the Couplonde, was driven onto rocks near the spar. From the cliffs, the sight was desperate. A ship rolling broadside to the sea, her masts half gone, figures clinging to the rigging. The lifeboat crew assembled quickly. Among them were coxswain John Burton, Thomas Brewster, William Tyndall, and several others whose families had fished out of Scarborough for generations. The men pulled on oilskins, tied cork life belts across their chests, and pushed the Amelia down the greased slipway. The launch itself was a struggle. Waves smashed across the beach, throwing spray high over the seawall. Horses strained against the ropes as the carriage lurched forward. The moment the keel touched water, the men jumped aboard. The lifeboat rocked violently, her bow facing into the surf, and with a shout of "let go," she was free. The first few minutes were chaos. Oars clattered, the boat rose and fell like a toy in the wash. From shore it looked impossible that they could live through it, but the crew fought their way clear of the breakers. They began to row toward the wreck. The wind roared across the bay, lifting spindrift that hid the boat from view. On the cliffs, hundreds of people watched in silence. Closer to the Coupland, the sea grew wilder. Waves came from two directions, from the open bay and from the cliffs near the spar where the swell rebounded. The water was so confused that even experienced fishermen could not tell where the next breaker would rise. The Amelia reached the outer edge of the surf and turned toward the wreck. The men bent their backs to the oars. They were less than 200 yards away when a huge sea lifted the lifeboat high, twisted her sideways and threw her forward. The stern smashed against a submerged rock. The impact tore open part of her bottom planking. For a moment she seemed to recover. The men pulled desperately to clear the danger, but the next wave drove her broadside into the spar wall. The sound of wood splintering could be heard even from the promenade. One of the oars snapped in two. The boat heeled sharply, filled with water, and capsized. Shouts rose from the crowd on shore. Men ran into the surf, throwing ropes, others waded out waist-deep, trying to reach the wrecked lifeboat. Among them were Lord Charles Beauclerk and a local merchant named John Ives. They fought their way through the breakers toward the upturned hull, but the sea was merciless. Both were struck down and drowned. Out at the wall, the lifeboat rolled again. Two of the crew managed to cling to the keel, others were swept away. Coxswain Burton and his men had only minutes in the freezing water. When the tide eased, bodies began washing ashore along the beach. 3 of the lifeboat crew were dead, along with the 2 volunteers from the crowd. The Coupland's sailors, for whom the rescue had begun, had by then been thrown clear of their own vessel and saved by other means. At dusk, the tide left the shattered hull of the Amelia lying on the sands. Her copper fittings were twisted, her thwarts broken, her oars scattered along the bay. The people of Scarborough gathered around the wreck in disbelief. A boat built for saving life had instead become the cause of mourning. All through that night, the bells of St. Mary's tolled for the dead. Families kept lamps burning in their windows overlooking the bay. The smell of seaweed and tar filled the air. The following morning, coffins were carried through the narrow streets to the churchyard. The wind still blew hard from the sea, whipping the black cloth on the pallbearers' shoulders. In town meetings over the following week, questions rose from every corner. Had the lifeboat been too lightly built? Was her keel too shallow for the weight of surf off the spar? Should she have launched from the North Bay instead, where the bar was longer but the shore safer? Engineers studied her remains and reported that while the Amelia met the institution's standards, no design could have survived that combination of wind, tide, and reflection from the cliffs. The tragedy forced changes. The RNLI sent inspectors to every East Coast station. They reviewed how lifeboats were launched in harbours exposed to reflected seas. They insisted on better training for coxswains in reading local tides and wave patterns. They also began developing a stronger class of self-righting boats with heavier keels and deeper bows, better able to withstand side impacts. The reforms were slow but steady, each rule written in response to a loss like Scarborough's. In Scarborough itself, the town raised money for the families of the dead. Merchants, fishermen, and visitors donated. Children dropped pennies into tins. By December, a memorial stone was placed near the pier listing the 5 who perished. Above their names, the words were carved, "They went out to save others." The echo of that November day never left the town. Generations of lifeboatmen after them remembered the Amelia whenever they trained in rough water. Her name was spoken quietly before launches in heavy weather. When new boats arrived, heavier, faster, enclosed, the crews would run their hands along the hull and say, "Not like the first one." The spar wall still stands, rebuilt many times since. On winter days when an easterly wind blows, the waves break in almost the same pattern as they did that afternoon. The sound of surf against stone carries far inland. Those who walk the promenade can look down and picture the scene. A small boat, bright and new, lifting on a grey sea, heading straight into the storm. The reform that came after her loss reshaped lifeboating on the Yorkshire coast. It created stronger craft, safer harbours, stricter discipline. Yet the echo of the Amelia lives on, in the design of every rescue boat that came after, in every cautious glance at the tide tables, in every moment before launch, when the coxswain looks out to the horizon and measures risk against duty. And when the siren sounds across Scarborough Bay on a rough November night, the lifeboat slides again into the same water, its lights cutting through the darkness. The men aboard know the story. They know whose voices still ride beneath the surf. The Amelia's first service never truly ended. It continues each time another crew answers the call. Every lifeboat that launches today carries their memory. The names, the boats, the storms, all part of the same story written by courage and loss. They went out so others could live, and in every wave that breaks along the shore their duty still echoes.